Hey there. Welcome to the live stream. My name is Michael Lynn, and this is the MongoDB Podcast Live. Today, we're talking with Ali El Rhermoul from Beamable, and we've got our good friend Nick Raboy joining us to lead the conversation as it relates to games and the gaming industry. Let me first welcome you, Ali. How are you?
Hi, doing great. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Nick, good to see you again, buddy.
I know, Mike. It's been a good couple of years since I last appeared on this podcast with you,
Well,
but
it's
I'm
great
glad
to
to be
have you
back.
back. Yeah, right on. What have you been doing in the in the absence of being on the podcast?
A lot of videos, so technical tutorials for MongoDB, a lot of written content.
Yeah.
So just changing up the platform a little bit as far as getting developer content out.
Outstanding. Well, let's welcome our guest, Ali El Rhermoul from Beamable. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and let folks know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So let me just start by saying, in case you hadn't picked it up from my name, I'm actually originally from Morocco, but I live on the east coast of the United States. The only reason I mentioned that is because Morocco just beat Spain at the World Cup game, which was super exciting. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. So go Atlas Lions. But for those of you who aren't soccer fans, which I am not, only once every 4 years, um, the um, the role that I have at Beamable is a CTO. So that means I'm in charge of all technology and product initiatives. My background of a computer science nature. I've cut code. I've built large distributed systems. I've been using Mongo for about a decade now. Through its early days of having to self-host it, and today with Atlas, we've at Beamable, we basically our mission is to fight for the game maker and to make it really easy for the dominant game business model, which is the free-to-play business model, to be adopted by a very large number of game developers. So being able to monetize your games after the fact, be able to add leaderboards and tournaments and things that make your game continuously operated, new content updates, new monetization, new offers, so forth and so on. So that's what Beamable is, a live ops platform in that sense. Before that, I shipped large licensed IP games, which I made, including a Game of Thrones game, a Star Trek game, a Walking Dead game, an Archer game, at a company called Disruptor Beam, which I was a founding engineer at. And before that, I was a dedicated modder. Did a lot of modding in all kinds of games. Got my start in game development, actually, in early days of StarCraft 1 modding and others. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So when you,
Well, thanks for that
okay,
overview. Nick, I just want to let folks know, so welcome to the show once again. And for the folks just joining us, uh, we're going to be talking about the gaming industry. I'm a little bit out of my element. I am a developer, but I have not developed games. So Nick, I'm gonna take a back seat.
that's all right. That's all right. Yeah, I was going to ask a little bit more about your gaming uprising, Ali. So you modded some StarCraft stuff. You worked for the studio and built a few games. What kind of technologies were you using when you were building these games?
It's a good question. So, in my professional game developer career, for the, let's say, quote unquote, loosely use the term front end here, for the client application that gets delivered to the end devices, whether that's your PC or mobile phones, we used game engines like Unity, but also we built a fully web game in the days of quote unquote social games, as they were called. So the era of Zynga type of games, we built a game for Facebook Canvas, which was a pure web game, HTML5, WebGL, and then on the backend side, Ruby on Rails, with a MySQL backend at that time. And then when we built and launched our second game, we really didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And this was circa 2012, just so folks get a sense. Like that was when Supercell was just really sort of starting their meteoric rise with Heyday and Clash of Clans, and mobile was just getting started, right? So you had these massive featuring opportunities with Apple, where you'd get featured and all of a sudden 2 million players would show up in your game, right? That rarely happens these days. But but that's what it was like back then. So at that time, that was what I like to call the era of invention for live ops. So if you were building a live operated game, that is a game that is continuously updated and continuously monetized in a service-like manner, you were going to be you're going to be building the game in a certain way, with commerce and merchandising systems, with tournaments that keep the players engaged, with rewards attached to those tournaments. And there was no off-the-shelf components for this stuff. You had to basically build it yourself, hence the era of invention. Some amount of years later, you would get the era of engineering efficiencies, that is, or engineering optimizations. You get all these libraries that started cropping up that would cut down on the amount of time. And then Beamable, the era that Beamable showed up in, is the era that's creator centric, right? So we want to allow like an individual developer, who doesn't have a DevOps team, who doesn't have, these large infrastructure teams, to be able to build these kinds of experiences. So to sort of bring it back to your question, the first game was WebGL HTML5 with the Ruby on Rails backend. The second game was a Unity engine game with a Ruby on Rails backend, but also a generalized layer, which was the beginnings of our live ops platform, which was coded in Java and Scala with a Mongo database as its primary general purpose database.
Nice. And I do want to dig in deeper to that in a minute, though. I do have a few more questions based on stuff that you brought up. So you mentioned, I believe I heard you say live ops in there,
Yes.
for the scenery where it's constantly changing, right? Is just so that way I can bring it to a level that I'm familiar with modern gaming and stuff. Is that kind of in the sense of like, I don't know if you play Fortnite at all, where they release seasons, right? They release seasons where basically they introduce something new every time. Is that the same thing as live ops, or is it a different kind of definition? I just want clarity.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So again, games that sort of, in the old days, games were basically shrink wrapped and put on a shelf somewhere, and you would show up at the store and you'd buy your game, and then you would play the game and then move on, right? And that colored the entire business model of the game developers as well, right? They'd work on a game, and then once they'd ship it, they'd essentially move on to the next game. But today we live in the era where games last for a very, very long time. Clash of Clans is 10 years old now, and it's still going strong. It's still being continuously updated, continuously monetized. So Fortnite is the same kind of thing. These games become living, breathing products that evolve and transcend the sort of classical product lifecycle definition. So yes, the seasons, the new content, upgrades to the engine, all of that stuff contributes to a live ops product. And just to put some numbers to it, today games revenue is about $170 billion per year, roughly. And the lion's share of that, the vast majority of that revenue, something well above 90%, is from games that are monetized after the fact. That is, you don't necessarily pay for them up front. You pay for items, skins, vanity items, whatever it may be, in the game after the fact, and you are continuously monetized as a player. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so games like Overwatch or Fortnite or games where you're buying character outfits and stuff like that,
Exactly.
even though that the base rate of the game is free to play.
League of Legends. Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
Got it. So you mentioned Beamable being for creators, right? So you shared your kind of gamer story with us and how you got sort of there. What really opened up to the creation of Beamable? Like, what was that idea? What did it spawn out of?
Well, I think fundamentally we just realized so when we were building games are tremendously difficult things to make, right? Not only do you have a technically sophisticated, product, you have a 3D game engine front end, or even if it's a 2D front end, it takes a lot of work to build those UIs and have them behave the way that you expect, visual effects, sound effects, all of that stuff. So the client application you deliver to the devices is already very rich technically. Then there's a potential backend component, which is used to enable multiplayer functionality, competitive gameplay, which is very engaging, but also difficult to build. Now you're thinking, building backend services, having a AWS cloud account potentially, or Azure or whatnot, managing a database, making sure that everything is secure. So having a DevOps team, like all of that stuff requires a lot of effort. And even if you were to get both of those things right, your game might still not be fun, right? So you have this sort of immaterial aspect of the game has to be super fun. It requires technical chops that are very advanced on the front end and technical chops that are very advanced on the back end, right? So part of what Beamable, and so what that means is that your teams, your game teams, become very large. And as anybody who's worked on large teams will tell you, once you enter that phase of like consensus-based decision making, you're almost doomed, right? Like it becomes really hard to achieve any kind of agreement. There's organizational barriers that get erected. There's communication barriers that are born. And the most fun, some of the biggest upsets we've seen in games have been these really small teams of like 2 to 3, 4, or 5 people who build this incredible experience, and all of a sudden overnight it's an incredible success. Even within large companies, right? A Hearthstone was built by a team of I think like 7 to 15 people, and that was within a behemoth of a company using a relatively new engine at the time, which was Unity. So that was a completely different way of approaching game development, to go from these very large multi-year waterfall product development cycles to these very small teams that are incredibly agile. So in order to preserve that agility, we want to do away with all of the complexity of the distributed systems and all of the complexity that sort of stands in your way to build a live ops product.
So you mentioned that at least from your own personal past and experience as not only just a game developer who used Unity and WebGL, but you also mentioned Ruby on Rails as a backend. Beamable, it sounds like Beamable does a whole lot. Who exactly is it targeting from the developer spectrum? Like, there's a lot that goes into game development. There's back-end engineers. There's the people who actually ship the game that you play. Who is the targeted audience for Beamable exactly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that the simple answer is the small and medium-sized developers first and foremost, because they are least likely to have the resources to build this kind of platform themselves, right?
Which game developers exactly, though? Like there's a whole spectrum of that encompasses the game developer, right? Not just
Sure.
the visual aspect of it.
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
everyone?
so, it's basically everyone. So I mean, it's maybe not the sound designer, I'll put it that way, but like anybody who's designing meta game systems, right? Economies, game economies, virtual economies, items, currencies, so forth and so on. Anybody who's participating in the design of balance content, right? Like how much damage a character does, what items exist in the game, what are the bosses, and so forth and so on. The role that would be classically a back-end developer, somebody implementing multiplayer systems or competitive systems. So it's actually quite a large cross section. And we also have drag and drop prefabs, so like fully actualized UIs that you could pull into your game. So even UI designers have something for them. So it's a pretty broad swath of the game development team. Does that make sense, Nick?
It does. Sorry, I accidentally muted myself.
That's all good. And sort of to just elaborate on that answer just a little bit more, it's also in some ways kind of asking like, who is AWS for when we talk about the size of the game developer? Like at one point you had the Activision Blizzards of the world were like, well, we don't need AWS. Like we have our own data centers. Like why would we need to use it? But over time you come to realize that it's just not worth your time to be spending a whole lot of engineering resources and energy and mind share reinventing what is essentially undifferentiated work, right? It's not the thing that makes, having data centers is not what makes Blizzard special, right? Or Activision or whomever, right? What makes them special is their games. So part of what we're in the business of doing is removing that undifferentiated heavy lifting so that you can focus on your key differentiator, which is the fun aspect of your game.
Yeah. So to begin using Beamable, what does somebody need to know, and what are the kind of environmental constraints?
Yeah, so good question. We have a package for Unity, which is readily available. You can download it from the Unity Asset Store. We're a verified solutions partner, and And you just go inside of Unity, open up the package manager, and you can install this from there, or go to the Beamable website, or go to the Unity Asset Store. Then we're actually working on an Unreal SDK right now, which is on GitHub, on our public GitHub, which Unreal developers can start experimenting with and give us feedback. And then we've also had situations where people are building their own game engines or have a custom game engine in C++ or are using a game engine we don't explicitly have a package for. And so we have actually an open API spec that is a definition of all of Beamable's APIs published on our docs website. So you can actually invoke our APIs for all the backend services directly from via HTTP web requests. And you can also generate, because that open API spec is public, you can also generate your own SDK in whatever language you choose.
And what are some of the real common features that right out of the gate people are going to be looking to use from Beamable? Like a leaderboard? Like what are some of the really key features?
Yeah, so a lot of people love pulling in leaderboards first, commerce offers. We also see a lot of people love using our content system. Content is just sort of the ability to deliver new content over the wire. So you don't have to force. I mean, we've all seen those annoying update prompts. It's like, you can't use the app anymore. Go and update the app, right? Like, part of avoiding anytime you throw that kind of prompt in front of players, some percentage of those players will never show up to your game again, right? They will essentially churn. So being able to update content over the wire is of paramount importance. And it's also important in the case of bugs. If you were to release some content with a bug, being able to update it over the wire is super important. So our content system is very popular. And then we also have a whole identity system, so that players can manage their account. Facebook login, Google login, sign in with Apple. You can drag and drop a prefab into your game, and you basically have that functionality. And it's GDPR compatible, so if players want to forget their accounts, they can do that. And that's just, a lot of game developers find that super useful, because nobody gets into games to implement login with Apple, right? Like, it's just not the priority. So being able to provide that functionality out of the box is it just helps developers focus on what really matters to their games.
Yeah.
In regards to the content management system stuff that you're doing in there, I think that's what you called it or something similar.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mike. Is it the assets that they're able to ship over the wire? Is it just like multimedia assets, or do you actually get to make revisions to your code and have that applied in real time, I guess? What's the limitation?
Question. Yeah, good question. So we do not allow code updates, and that's not really a limitation on our side so much as it's a limitation oftentimes of the game engine, because a lot of the client code is actually at the game engine level, but also it's a limitation of the app stores themselves, who often do not like the idea of code changing within clients. And that's because malicious code could be injected over the wire, and it could skip over the approval processes that App Store curators such as Apple really do care about. So you can't do it code. You can deliver over the wire any kind of structured data, such as some kind of a JSON compatible data, any kind of object data, and we have support for multimedia files, but think 3D meshes, audio files, etc. But it's not currently, let's say it's in preview right now. It's not something that we have made public yet.
Okay, so I'm a game developer. I wanna get what I'm working on out to the world. I want to incorporate some of these great features that you're talking about. What's it going to cost me to incorporate those features from Beamable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will just refer you to our pricing website. You just go to Beamable.com.
But there's a free tier, right?
But there is a free tier.
Yeah, right on.
So unlike some of the other companies in this space, we actually allow you to download Beamable and just try it right away. You don't need to talk to us. You don't need to reach us, pick up the phone. You don't need to email us. Just go to the Unity Asset Store or go to our website, download the package. You can start using it right away. And for as long as you're in development, you can use it for free. There are a couple of constraints there. Certain services that do cost money. Once you use more than a certain amount, then we will ask you to pay. But the tiers are fairly gradual. So yeah.
Great. And hopefully, by reducing the overhead associated with implementing and maintaining those things, they'll see value right away. So I'm curious about your use of MongoDB. How early on in the development stage of Beamable did you start using MongoDB? And then I want to ask you also about the features that you're using from the MongoDB Atlas platform.
Oh, sure, yeah. We've been using Mongo Atlas from day one at Beamable, and Atlas has been awesome. I mean, I can say that with a lot of confidence, and this is not like, any kind of advertisement or anything like that. I can say it because we've been using Mongo since Wired Tiger was first released, and since before Wired Tiger was released, and we operated large sharded Mongo clusters, and it was challenging, right? Like operating databases at scale is very challenging. Updating the database to a new version is nerve wracking, right? Because if you do something wrong, your database is down, your players can't play the game, right? So Atlas made all of that trivial and made it something that we never had to think about. So database updates, failover events happen transparently with zero downtime, without any latency spikes. Mongo Atlas introduced the ability to adopt new features very readily and easily. In terms of the kinds of features we use, we've been using the replica sets, the regular replica sets. We've used sharded clusters. We operate a large sharded cluster. We also have used Mongo Atlas charts. We've used a lot of the we haven't used any of the data lake functionality yet, but we plan to use the Lucene text search index capabilities, which is super cool. We use a lot of the engine functionality, the sort of deep sort of database stuff. And we are very excited by the serverless offering, which we'd like to make greater use of and also offer to Beamable customers as a plug-and-play solution to the microservices functionality we provide, which is a serverless cloud code solution.
I do want to ask about those microservices in just a second, but I want to ask a question about your Atlas usage. So you said you used Atlas from day one, and now you're a pretty successful company. You've got a lot of gaming customers doing a whole heck of a lot on your service. What's your scaling story like for that? I mean, I assume that you wouldn't have needed much from day one, but now you probably are using a lot more. Let's say that. What did that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. It's not a simple answer, but I would say, I think we have kind of two flavors of deployments. We have dedicated deployments. So we have certain customers that come to us and say, I don't want to share, right? Like I want my own dedicated Mongo cluster and I want you to manage it for me. And we're happy to do that. And then we have other customers that are like, don't talk to me about Mongo. I don't want to know about any of that stuff. I'm happy with a multi-tenanted solution. I just want to focus on my game. And so the default is a multi-tenanted sharded Mongo cluster. And so we have all kinds of auto scaling rules and monitoring on it to make sure that as high watermarks are reached, either the cluster automatically scales vertically, or we get notified that we're reaching some kind of high watermark. And so there's a whole bunch of institutional operational knowledge that we've developed to be really good at this, right? And anticipate when we need to add another shard versus vertically scale, when we should increase the oplog size, when we should increase the disk size, what's the best bang for the buck, right? Sometimes provisioning IOPS is a better option. Other times it's really not. You just want to increase your disk size because it gives you more IOPS by default. So there's a lot of variables that are inherent to database operations, and these are things that we've first learned. The team that built Beamable also built a lot of large-scale games, that have seen over 20 million players come through them. So we've just developed a lot of institutional know-how there.
So to add to that, you mentioned serverless. I didn't catch if you were referring to serverless functions or serverless instances. But where my question is going is, say you're chugging along doing what you're doing right now, you end up with this kind of unicorn game that releases with your platform, and it requires such a high demand on your Beamable's resources. Like, what do you have in place to be able to accommodate that? Do you use any kind of automatic scaling? Do you use the serverless instances? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so basically, think of it this way: there's the set of Beamable managed services. So these are services that Beamable has written, and we provide an API to them, right? These include inventory, tournaments, events, and many, many more, right? And these have all been assiduously optimized to make the best, most efficient, most performant use of Mongo. And there is also a distributed actor system that we built in-house, which means that reads are, read from in memory, which makes for very fast reads. And of course, we use Mongo in a way so that the writes are super fast as well. So all of these managed services have auto scaling rules. They elastically scale, no single points of failure, and they'll just add capacity elastically based off of throughput, right? Then there's Mongo itself, which is fortunately, unlike many databases, has sharding functionality, which means you can horizontally scale Mongo as well. And we've designed all of these managed services to make use of the sharded functionality. So they all have properly defined shard keys that can be horizontally distributed in a way that doesn't create hotspots and so forth and so on. And then lastly, there's the custom code that our customers sometimes come to us and say, well, I want to write some server code and I don't want to host it on my own account. I want you to host it for me. And in such cases, we have a serverless offering called C# microservices that allows them to write server code inside of Unity, inside of the game engine, hit a publish button, which sends that code to Beamable and then gets scheduled in a container, which gets automatic auto scaling rules attached to it as well, right? So all along the stack, there's automatic scaling, and in situations where automatic scaling may be, let's say, less desirable, such as the database layer, we have all kinds of monitors and a team in place to make sure that the scaling is cost efficient and performant.
Because I want to nerd out for a second here. You mentioned the microservices a few times now. I'm curious to learn more about those. So you said you could develop these microservices directly within the Unity editor.
Yeah.
To what scale? I mean, do you get the full scope of .NET in them? I mean, or is there local testing capabilities for your service? You want to go into more detail about that? How that works?
Totally. So first and foremost, I'll just mention that we do have a white paper on this topic that goes in pretty deep detail. If you just go to the Beamable website, download the technical white paper if you want all the details. But it's a system we're very proud of, and it's one that we've developed really from our experience as game developers. So when you want to write server code today, and oftentimes you're in one of two situations. You either have to sort of develop your own stack, right? Pick Ruby on Rails or Node.js or whatever, and then spin it up in an AWS account and set up load balancers and subnets and security groups and all of that fun stuff. Except it's not fun, right? And nobody wants to do that, especially when you're on a deadline trying to ship a game. Then you have sort of the other side of the equation, which is a bunch of lambdas and cloud script. And so oftentimes you're pigeonholed into a specific programming language like JavaScript or TypeScript, and you're coding in a browser window, right? There's literally companies out there that do similar things to us. You're coding in a browser window, and that's problematic because you don't have proper debugging. You can't have your code live side by side with your client code. Tests are a lot harder to write. It's just a workflow nightmare. And that's a word I haven't mentioned yet, but workflow is a key differentiator for Beamable. We want to make sure that the workflows work for the game developers. So the reason we brought this experience inside of Unity is because that's where the game developers live. They want to be inside of this game engine window. They're writing all their client code, and they want to be able to debug up and down the stack. So when you go inside of Unity and you install the Beamable package, you'll get a little window that says, this is your microservice manager. Do you want to create a microservice? And you click yes. And we basically automatically install a container image on your computer. You can run this application locally. You can debug it in the same IDE as you're debugging your client's code. So you can literally have two slices of code, one that's your C# microservice server code with the entire range of .NET, and the other one that is your Unity C# flavor code, and have breakpoints in each. And as you run your Unity, when you hit play in the Unity editor window to sort of preview your game, it will actually break points on both sides. And so that up and down the stack debugging is extremely powerful. your code lives side by side. You can share serialization structures between your client and your server. You don't have to redefine things in multiple times in multiple programming languages. And you can really reduce the sort of degree of specialization that you need within your game developer team. Does that make sense?
Wow. Yeah, I'm just blown away at the coverage. Like you've really thought about this, and it's clear that you've got a great deal of real world experience developing games yourself. Um, I'm curious about the future. Like what's coming down the pike? What's exciting for you in the game industry?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I'm a lifelong gamer. I love playing games. I love making games. I love building technology for games. I'm super excited by the fact that it's just the beginning. We're still seeing double-digit growth in the games industry. We're seeing a massive increase in not just the amount of revenue generated by games, which means more game developers enter the fray, more creativity is entering the fray, but we're also seeing just far more people who 10 years ago didn't identify as gamers enter the fray. 50-year-old moms playing their games and now consider themselves gamers, playing with multi-generational games and demographically, a more even distribution where you have a lot more women playing games, like 50% now, which means that you get a richer confluence of different games, more interesting experiences. I was just playing It Takes Two with my wife, a week ago or a couple of weeks ago during Thanksgiving. It was incredibly fun and type of experience that really didn't exist 15 years ago or so. So number one, I'm excited about that, right? Just the degree of inclusiveness that we're seeing in game, which is spawning a lot of creativity. And then I think I would say from a sort of the game developer in me, I'm also super excited by the era of creativity that we're entering. It used to be that games, again, somebody who grew up abroad, it used to be the games was the purview of a very small number of companies, usually quite large companies, or small studios that are essentially owned by very large publishers in a small handful of countries, right? United States, Japan, and so forth. But today, it's a truly international field. You're seeing game companies getting acquired in Turkey for billions of dollars. You're seeing, what some of the top game developers in the world are in small Scandinavian countries, right? Small populations. So you're seeing this highly, this bursting of creativity, as well as this, this growth that is including more countries, more people, more types of games, and it's only the beginning, because now you even have very small teams of 1 to 5 people building games that can become blockbusters, right? With the advent of the app stores, the distribution problem has essentially been solved to a large degree. So that's all very, very exciting to me, and the part that I'm hoping that we can do when we talk about fighting for the game maker at Beamable, what we really care about is allowing allowing these sort of the Davids to really take on the Goliaths, right? Like allowing the small, 1 to 3, 4, 5 person teams to build experiences that are unhindered by the need for very large resources or very large teams, right? So and I think Roblox, this is a trend we've seen sort of across the board, right? Like that ability, you've seen it now in the AI generated art, right? You see it in in the way that that Stripe and Shopify have enabled individuals to sell things online in ways that were unprecedented 20 years ago. So that's what I'm excited about. In some ways, the democratization of the creative endeavor to an ever greater and ever more diverse body of creators.
Yeah.
I love that.
You mentioned a lot about these indie studios, and I agree with you. They're resonating with me. Like you think of and I'm sure you've probably played or at least heard of some of these games, like Stardew Valley. Like
totally,
I think that was one single guy made this game that probably made millions of dollars. You got Celeste, you've got Hollow Knight, you got all these small studios that are making killings on console and Steam and things like that. It's amazing what people are accomplishing right now.
Yeah, and a whole platform like Roblox, which has also enabled this like across all ages, right? Like it's truly incredible and inspiring, and I want to see more of that, and I want to be part of that, right?
Yeah, well, I certainly think you are. We're just about out of time, but I want to ask you, the seed of creation, the seed of a great game. I mean, some really fascinating games are coming across, like just things that you don't even think are games, but they are. Where does that come from for you? It's Joseph Campbell came up with this idea that there's a hero with 1,000 faces. There's like 12 different phases for every myth that has been created, and kind of mapped out every story that's ever been told. And I'm wondering, do you think we'll ever get to the end of game creation, or how do you continue to innovate? How do you continue to create something interesting? And where does that
Yes,
seed
it's a
come from
good
for you?
question. It's a good question. I mean, it's almost like asking, like, will we ever get to the end of art, right? Like,
Hmm.
I don't. I frankly, I think that the biggest threat that I see to that, and it's not really a threat. It's more like just the next sort of step in human progress is AI. Frankly, like when you go to, so I don't know if you guys have been seeing like some of the GPT
Yeah.
3.5 open chat bot, like it's crazy. Like our CEO John Radoff has a pretty cool blog post where he literally generated a mud game inside of GP3, like Zork type of game, literally through a prompt. And he just basically put in a prompt and said, hey, AI, pretend, never go out of character, pretend you're the game, and I'm going to play a text-based game. And it generated the game. He was literally
Love it.
playing in this chat. So like, when does that become not of course, MUDs were like 30 years ago now, but when does that go from being, sort of the ability to generate a MUD to be able to generate a full-on, game experience? And I don't think it's that far off, right? I think it's maybe another 10 years at most. With GPT-4 on the horizon in 2023, we'll see what that looks like. So I don't really think that there's necessarily an end to it. I think it will continue and continue. The tools will just change. But it'll be interesting to see how AI changes the landscape there.
Yeah. Well, Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like folks to know about Beamable, about yourself?
I would say check out our Discord. Come hang out with us, whether you're making a game or not. Like, we're always happy to hear about your experiences. If you are making a game, come join us. Tell us about your game. If you need a live ops backend, try out Beamable. Let us know your thoughts. Like, we consider ourselves first and foremost game developers. We're building Beamable because we saw a gap, and at some point everybody expects that we'll go back to making games. At least some of us will move on and make games, and we wanted to create Beamable first so that we would have this tool chain for when we go back to doing that. So come say hello.
Fantastic. Nick, anything further?
No, I love the conversations today. This is great. The links for Discord and et cetera will probably show up in the show notes, right, Mike?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
Good stuff. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Awesome.